Welcome for those who are joining us. Thank you. We'll get started in just a minute or two. For those who are joining us, I'm Dr. Jessica Jackson. I'm the Global DEIB Care Lead for Modern Health, and I encourage you to share with us in the chat where you're from, your pronouns, your name, anything you're comfortable sharing, just so we can get to know some of the people who are joining us today. So please feel free to join us in the chat, and we will get started in about 1 minute. We just want to give everyone the opportunity to be able to trickle into the room. Thank you. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. As I get started, we will have a question and answer session at the end. So please feel free to share any questions in the chat. I will be moderating the chat and keeping an eye on questions. And please, like I said, feel free to share who you are, where you're from, anything to help us to get to know you. We'd love to learn more about who's joining us today. As I mentioned, I'm Dr. Jessica Jackson. I'm the Global Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging Care Lead here at Modern Health. And joining me today, I am so excited to introduce Dr. Tanya Israel. Dr. Israel is a professor of counseling psychology and affiliated faculty with the Department of Feminist Studies at UCSB. She holds a PhD in counseling psychology, a master's degree in human sexuality education, and a bachelor's degree in psychology and women's studies. As director of UCSB's Project RISE, Dr. Israel leads a research team that develops and studies interventions to support the psychological health of LGBTQ individuals and communities. Her expertise on LGBTQ issues has been solicited by the Institute of Medicine, the National Institutes of Health, and the White House. Dr. Israel has received honors for her research and advocacy from Congress, the American Psychological Association, the California Asian and Pacific Islander Legislative Caucus, and her local LGBT community. Her TEDx talk on bisexuality has been viewed over 100,000 times, and she tweets bisexual haiku at Tanya_Israel. Sorry, it's Tanya_Israel, not a dot. And I am super excited. I have read Dr. Israel's work in grad school, and I'm excited for this conversation today. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to her to get started. Welcome, Dr. Israel.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I am thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to have this fireside chat. I thought I would thank you for the introduction and thank everybody for sharing who you are in the chat section. It's nice to get to know more about you. I thought I would share a little bit more about me, and so you have some idea of sort of what I've been doing and what my areas of expertise are, so you can think about what kinds of questions you might want to ask, and I hope you do. I had to put up fireside chat because I thought, oh, like the end of June, totally when people want to go to a fireside chat. So I think that you all are great for being here and weathering the warmth of the experience. So anyway, what I've been doing for over 2 decades now is research mostly on interventions to support LGBTQ people and communities. And that has been a wide range of things, including learning about therapy experiences of LGBTQ people. I've done community-based participatory research on what the community's priorities are. I've done training for law enforcement on LGBTQ issues and done work on creating online resources to help LGBTQ folks feel more positive about themselves. You can see in these pictures some of the graduate students who I've worked with. We call our work that we do Project Rise, and they've also really extended the work to bring more intersectionality into it, to create resources for parents of LGBTQ youth. So we really do a lot of wonderful work together on the team. Jessica mentioned that I do have some expertise in bisexuality. So I just wanted to share a little bit about that because I do want to talk some about that. You know, early on, my work had been focused on LGBTQ issues broadly, but then I started doing some writing about my own experience being bisexual and biracial, and as I started sort of doing that, I also brought more of it into my research. And then in 2015, I gave a TEDx talk about bisexuality, and so that really brought me into more circles of people who were doing that work, brought me to the first White House bisexual community policy briefing, and we brought in, you know, more visibility to that in terms of bisexuality. And then I came home and I started a group for people in Santa Barbara who are bisexual, and we've been having this discussion group ever since then. So there's a lot of work that I've done on bisexuality, both in terms of research, advocacy, public speaking, and also just in terms of my community building support. I do like to bring creative aspects into this, and so I often wear the colors of the bisexual flag. You're seeing a lot of rainbow flags this month for Pride Month, but I want to make sure that people know that there's other flags too. There's a transgender flag, there's a bisexual flag, and I also do write bisexual haiku, like this one, and you can follow me on Twitter if you want to see my bisexual haiku, or look for the hashtag Baiku. So that's just a little bit about me, you know, but I know we're here to talk about workplace issues in particular. And so I just want to, that's who I am and some of the work that I've done. And now Jessica and I get to have a little bit of a conversation. But if you've got questions, then please share them, because we want to make sure that we get to the kinds of content that you want to know about.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Dr. Israel. So we did something a little bit different this time. We did ask people to also share, they had the opportunity to share questions when they registered. So some of the questions today will be questions that have come from the registration questions. And so to start us off, I'd like to use one of those questions first. And one of the first questions we had was, how, if at all, have you seen the reception to your work change over time? And I think that's a great place for us to start about where we were and where we are now, so we can also think about ways that we can grow.
It's a fantastic question, because it also, you know, says a lot about, as we think about LGBTQ people in the workplace, we've got people in the workplace at a range of different ages. So I think really thinking about this in terms of generational issues is also really important. So I started doing work on LGBTQ issues when it was in the 90s. In the mid 90s, I was trying to decide what to do for my dissertation. And I was thinking about doing this thing on training therapists to work with LGB clients. And I said to my advisor, if I do my work on LGBT issues, am I ever going to get an academic job? And that was really where it felt like at the time, this might just knock me out of the running, that I might not get hired if this is what the focus of my work is going to be. But I went ahead and I did it anyway with her encouragement. And the interesting thing about it is it turns out that this is what has made my career, really, because like shortly after that, people started recognizing that this is a community that we need to do more for, that we need to have more research about, that we need to prepare therapists to work with. And so then it just, it became sort of the signature of my work. And I actually, you know, became, you know, people were wanted to hire me because of that. So it really turned it around. And one of the things that's been really significant is that when I started doing more community-based work and really hearing about what people in the community wanted, instead of just kind of coming up with my own research ideas, it actually then put me in a better place even to do advocacy, whereby, I was called on to support the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, because they wanted to do more support for LGBTQ people, and there was some real resistance against that from some members of Congress. So I've seen at like all these points in my life, places where there's resistance and maybe this is going to be a barrier, but then where the work that I've done has actually given me more opportunity, and opportunity also to support other people in it. So I have seen tremendous change. Right now, the fact that you've invited me to do this, the fact that during Pride Month, there are companies, a lot of companies that are wanting to do programming on LGBTQ issues for Pride Month, that's tremendous. That would not have happened 20 years ago. And so I'm so encouraged. The one last thing I'll say about this is that I hear people say, well, things are so much better now than they used to be. And when I think about the experience of LGBTQ people, I think, yeah, it used to be that things would go from absolutely horrific to pretty bad. And I feel like we've now we've expanded things a lot so that some people are having actually very positive and supportive experiences. And at the same time, it's still absolutely horrific for some people. And it's still pretty darn bad for some people. And we've got that whole range. So it's not like we went from here to here. It's like we went from here to widen the range. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, that the fact that it's so much better for some people doesn't mean that we don't still have challenges that are really defining for many others.
Thank you. I appreciate that dialectic, the both and, right? That things are getting better and there's still so much room to grow for everyone to feel included at work, to feel more inclusive.
Mhm.
I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, you've done a lot of amazing work, as you mentioned, with Congress, the White House, and your local community. Like, based on what you've learned from all of that, if you have some tips that you could share about how all of us can nurture environments at work that help colleagues to feel more safe discussing their different social identities, so that people will want to share. But I think what happens is sometimes we want to be able to support people, but we don't even know how to have a conversation, right? So how can I support someone if none of us are talking about how we identify, or like who we are, essentially at the core of it, who we are?
That's a great question. I sometimes think about this in terms of, with disability issues, we sometimes think about creating a workplace based on universal design, so that it's something that works for everyone. And so I think about that also in terms of LGBTQ issues, that we want to have a sort of universal design where even if you don't know if there's someone in the workplace who's LGBTQ, you want to create an environment where it feels supportive and comfortable for somebody who is, because there probably is somebody, even if you don't know that there is. So that's the first thing, is really just thinking about that broadly. I did look at, I'm gonna put something in the chat section, and this is from the Human Rights Campaign. They have this corporate equality index. So this is a way of thinking about what are the ways to make a workplace supportive, and they actually, can look at different workplaces based on that. So some of it has to do with making sure that whatever protections you have, whatever non-discrimination policies, are inclusive of LGBTQ people. Same thing with benefits, making sure that benefits are inclusive for LGBTQ workers and their families. And then there are things about, what about the actual climate, the flavor of what it's like. So one of the things that can help with that is making sure that there's training for all employees on LGBTQ issues. And there may be some specific training for supervisors and managers. There may be something that's worked into training for new hires. I think that just even talking about benefits and non-discrimination policies and talking about LGBTQ issues in there, just saying those words can make a difference to somebody who's coming in who either is LGBTQ, like that's going to help them to feel like, okay, it's all right to talk about here. But for somebody who's not LGBTQ to go, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Like there's an expectation that you're creating by that this is an environment that is supportive. It's also very helpful to have climate surveys periodically to see how things are going for employees and to make sure that people are able to, if they want, identify themselves as LGBTQ, and making sure that it's addressing issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. And there are some particular things that are needed for transgender employees. So making sure that there are some guidelines and policies in the workplace for supportive restrooms, dress codes, documentation, like all of those things may be particular challenges that the workplace can, again, be proactive in terms of making sure that there's support.
Got it. So definitely training, but also for people just thinking about whether we know how anyone identifies or not, how are we creating an atmosphere that feels inclusive without always knowing social identities, which is important.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And you talked about, like what about if people are talking about it, how do you talk about it? And, one of the things is like sometimes, it's about creating the atmosphere where people feel comfortable talking about it. But then when people do talk about it, I'm really hearing this question about like, what do we do about that? Like some people aren't going to be comfortable speaking up about their sexual orientation or gender identity, and some people are. And I think that it's important that that's okay, that people can self-identify but don't necessarily have to. And then when people do self-identify, I would say to validate that, but also not make that the only thing about that person, and not make it that now that person needs to be the spokesperson for those issues.
Absolutely agreed, right? The difference between valuing someone and helping them feel included and tokenizing sometimes, right? It's like, oh, now it's your job to teach us, right?
Yeah.
There was a follow-up question in the chat to that. They would love to hear more about when you were talking about transgender employees and embracing inclusivity.
Absolutely. I think sometimes, we think about, people get very caught up in, I don't know, like what terms to use, and I'm not sure what the right identity labels are, and I'm afraid I'm going to mess up with using pronouns and all of these things. So one of the things is not necessarily to be just so focused on the other person. Like we can all introduce ourselves using our pronouns. Whether or not, if there's somebody who's transgender, gender non-binary in the workplace, that just creates an atmosphere where that's a thing we do. We introduce ourselves by our name and our pronouns. So when people are speaking to us or making reference to us, they know how to do that. And that it's as simple as that. So it's not even, people worry so much about messing up other people's pronouns, but we can really start by just speaking our own. And I think that's always a good starting place. And then we need to practice. Like we're not necessarily used to doing this. We're especially often not used to people using they, them pronouns rather than he or she. And so one of the things to keep in mind is, first of all, language is always changing. And so, but using they as a singular pronoun actually goes back hundreds of years. So when people are like, but that's a new thing, why do we have to change? It's like, no, that was always there, and language is always changing. So for the grammarians out there, just know that there's a long history here. And then also try practicing it. Try practicing it, with friends in safe environments. Like if you feel like, I know that I need to do this at work, but I haven't used they as a singular pronoun. I actually started doing it when I like reading children's books. I'm like, there's no reason that we have to identify people, in a gendered way. We just use they, them for everyone in a book. And so that was also good practice for me to use they and them pronouns. So there's lots of ways that we can prepare ourselves for that. There's lots of ways that we can model that. And then everyone's so worried about messing up. And I get that. We don't want to mess up because we know that can also feel hurtful, and it can, that people might not feel like it's such an inclusive environment. And we've got to take that risk of messing up to try it. And when we do mess up, we can say, oh, I'm so sorry, that was the wrong pronoun. And then you don't have to like self-flagellate. You don't have to like go on and on about, how horrible a person you are and all of these things. Like, apologize and move on. And I think that that's something that's good for us to do in all realms of our lives, is be able to do an apology and be able to move on.
Thank you. So in the past, I was looking at some of the work you've done, and you've talked a lot about dialogue-based social justice advocacy. And I also know that you have a book about how to have conversations. And I would love for you to kind of share a little bit more about what that means. What is dialogue-based social justice advocacy, but how can it be used in the workplace to create more inclusive environments?
That's such a good question, because again, we're in conversation with people all the time, or there's opportunities for that. So yeah, I wrote a book, Beyond Your Bubble: How to Connect Across the Political Divide, Skills and Strategies for Conversations at Work. And it's really something where people, again, people are worried about messing up. People are worried about conflict. And so the thing that I always encourage is to lead with curiosity. And curiosity doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to like exhaust somebody by asking them to explain sexual orientation or gender identity to you. Like that's not necessarily the most useful curiosity. But leading by wanting to know about perspectives and experiences that are different from your own, rather than feeling like you need to shut yourself down and in stay in your own bubble. So this goes for people on sort of all sides of political issues, I would say, to want to be interested in where other people are coming from. So sometimes we'll hear somebody maybe use a term that we go, oh, that term's not very inclusive, and so I'm going to think about them as being somebody who's really not open to this. And sometimes it's just like they haven't been exposed to the terminology. They haven't met somebody who's got a different identity, or whatever it is. And so one of the things that I always try to do is be open to people, and say, oh, I noticed that you use this term. I'm curious about what makes you use that word, or oh, that's your identity. Like, oh, you say you're heterosexual. What does that mean to you? We can use it in all kinds of ways to be interested in people's experiences and to create a place where people can have conversations that are about wanting to know more, rather than feeling, sort of defended in our own bubbles.
Thank you. I think that leads to some of the questions that we had in the Zoom registration that are related to that, where we had multiple questions where people are wanting to know, how can I best educate myself to be a supportive ally in the workplace? And I'd love to hear any tips that you have related to that.
Yeah, I think first of all, thank you for asking that, because I think it really is important that we are educating ourselves and not expecting other people to do all the education for us. So again, that's a thing about curiosity, but remembering that it's exhausting for LGBTQ people or anyone to have to be the spokesperson for an educator for everybody else for their experience. So it's good to sort of direct that curiosity on learning things in other ways too. So reading is really helpful, like just reading about experiences. Now, and I don't have like, here's the book that's going to tell you all about LGBTQ people. But one of my favorite things to read is memoir, because that, it's not going to tell you this is what everyone's like, but I think it's wonderful because it gives so much more insight into individual people's experiences and emotions and all of that. So if you like stories, then that's a great way to do that. Another thing, in addition to learning about other people, is learning about ourselves. And if you are not LGBTQ, well, learn about what kinds of experiences are you having because you're not LGBTQ? What kinds of privilege might you be experiencing because of that? And people get really hung up on the privilege thing, but it's it it's helpful to understand our own privilege. Again, not so that we can feel terrible about having privilege, but so we can recognize the advantages that we've gotten that other people might not have gotten based on the group that they belong to. And that might motivate us to want to advocate for equality and to educate ourselves and to support other people. So exploring your privilege, engaging in community, so going to events that might make you a little bit uncomfortable, going to something that's outside of your comfort zone and your identities that you belong to, but it's great. If there's a pride festival, go to the pride festival. You don't have to be LGBTQ to go to the pride festival, and that will be good, exposing yourself to different kinds of people. The other thing I would say is you don't just have to rely on yourself to educate yourself. You can advocate in your work for your workplace to bring in someone with expertise so that not only are you going to get the education, but other people who might not be as individually motivated as you are will also benefit from that. And so I really encourage you to think in workplace settings as this is not just an individual issue. This is really thinking about a climate and trying to find ways of supporting that inclusive environment for everybody.
I appreciate that. I especially appreciate the reflection, self-reflection. I think one of the things we talk about here a lot at Modern Health is cultural humility, which is kind of like that inward self-reflection, the outward valuing and respect of others, and then how we grow from that. And so I really appreciate that emphasis. Like, I think it is hard to be an ally for someone else if we're not first looking at ourselves, right? And understanding ourselves.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
we
absolutely.
We had a really excellent question related to that in the registration that was related to the education that you were talking about. And the question was, what are a few common, easy to correct things said or done that are intending to be inclusive but actually cause hurt? How do we adjust? And I think that speaks to, like, when we're trying to be an ally, we recognize almost that we're making a mistake. How can we kind of readjust or correct so that we're not harming our colleagues?
Absolutely. Well, and I do think that that is the thing about if we make a mistake to apologize, but then move past it, because I think sometimes we get very self-focused when we feel like we've done something that's like wrong or inappropriate or harmful, but then we just kind of dig ourselves in deeper. But the other thing in terms of not digging yourself in deeper is to try not to be too defensive about it. Like when you do something, then you like don't make somebody then listen to your huge explanation about why you did that thing. That's actually not helpful to them. And I always think about when there are people who are marginalized in the workplace, whether it's LGBTQ people or anybody, and not just in the workplace, but anywhere, like think about how you are asking them to use their energy, to listen to you, to pay attention to your guilt about things. And that's actually not a supportive thing. So I would say, like, apologize, but then maybe say, uh, what is there any support that I can offer you in this workplace? Is there anything that we can do in the workplace to make this a better environment for you? But also not expect them to know everything and think of everything. Just because somebody's LGBTQ doesn't mean that they're an expert on, creating a workplace climate that's supportive for them. Like that's the job of the workplace to do.
Love that. Not taking all the responsibility and being able to recognize, like, it's shared. How can I support without putting it on the onus on any of our colleagues? Um, I We've been talking about, like, how to be an ally in education, and I'd love to hear, in your opinion, why it is imperative to the mental health of our LGBTQ colleagues that we actively, as organizations and companies, work to be more inclusive. Like, how does that help support the mental well-being of our colleagues when we're doing that?
No, that's such a good question. And, I appreciate that you're coming from like a mental health perspective and really thinking about, people come into the workplace as whole human beings, and the workplace also then affects us as human beings. So one of the things we know is that LGBTQ people do have these mental health disparities, that they have greater risks for depression and anxiety, suicidality, alcohol and drug abuse. But that's because of the environments that they're in. So LGBTQ people are in environments that are challenging to them, that are discriminatory, where there are negative messages. You know, when you're in an environment where you are hearing negative messages about yourself from media, from family, from peers, in school environments, when, you know, even so, when there are state laws that people are battling about LGBTQ issues, it affects the people in those states. It actually affects their mental health. To hear, you know, the arguments being made that no, you don't deserve the same rights, or no, you don't deserve protection from conversion therapy. You know, that when people are hearing those things, it actually affects their mental health. And so we have to remember that the workplace is one of those environments that can have that negative impact, and contribute to it. And the good news about that is it also means that the workplace is one of those environments that can try to support instead of doing that. Because that's one of the things that we know also, is that all of those stressors that LGBTQ people experience that non-LGBTQ people don't affect their mental health, but there are ways of interrupting that. And so some of the ways of interrupting that have to do with social support and helping, you know, so that there are things, you know, as a psychologist, I know, like, there are things that we can help individual people to do in terms of coping, but there are things that we can do in the environment to not just sort of make everything equal, but even maybe to lift people up more beyond that and to support resilience and thriving. And so I know that, you know, it's not all about flags. If all we're doing is putting up flags and saying it's Pride Month, like, that's not all that's needed. But that actually does make a difference. You know, it makes a difference for people to be recognized, and for people to see that their workplace actually cares about LGBTQ issues. So that there's a lot that can be done to not only sort of not do more harm, but to actually also provide some positive.
Thank you for that, and for focusing in on thriving and resilience. I think often when we talk about mental well-being and mental health, we focus on the negative aspects, how people are harmed, and we don't always focus on how can we help them? How can we be supportive? How can we help encourage anybody that's in our orbit to have optimal mental well-being? So I love that the emphasis on that.
Thank you.
We have a question that was in the registration that I think is related to what we're talking about for organizations. And the question is, how do you combat false allyship from leaders from within a company, or internal pinkwashing, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that people get concerned about now is, like, it, you know, people making statements, people like the flags, like, it's not enough, you know, that we go, like, that's not enough, that's not true allyship. I'm of two minds about this. I really am, because I think on one hand, oh, it's true, like, it's not enough. I mean, and we need more than that. We need policies. We need corporate responsibility in terms of what public statements are, in terms of where donations are going, in terms of engagement with community, in terms of recruiting workforce. Like, all of those things are really important. And it's still, like, the flags make a difference. So I feel like I never want to, you know, put down those maybe lower levels of engagement by saying, well, that's not doing enough. But at the same time, I feel like we get really caught up in making statements about things these days. It's like, okay, what's the statement going to be? And yes, it can make a difference to have the statement, but don't expend all of your ally energy and all of your corporate energy related to LGBTQ issues by crafting the right statement without recognizing that there's more that you have to do beyond that. So I would say, sort of a yes and again. It's like do those things and do more than those things. So I don't know that it's false allyship as much as it's partial allyship. You know, it's like, but sometimes you need that to get people to the next step also.
Got it.
And I'd be
So,
curious if the
mhm.
person who asked that question has sort of other more specific examples of, you know, that the pink washing, then feel free to share those.
Yeah. Please also feel free to share any questions in the chat. I'm moderating the chat, so I'm keeping an eye on it and also asking questions from when people registered. So please feel free to throw any questions in the chat for Dr. Israel. I think a good question that we had that came in the registration is basically understanding, how do you introduce LGBTQ advocacy to an organization that is kind of relatively new? So that they have new employees, but also there was a question specifically related to the organization is founded on religion. And so I think this
Mhm.
also speaks to a topic of stigma, if you're able to, of like, you know, people not always wanting to talk about certain topics. And so how can people introduce LGBTQ advocacy at work, but also if it's related to religion, if their employer is related to religion?
Absolutely. So I realized that before, when I shared this resource, I had only sent it out to panelists. So now it's going out to everyone in the chat section. This is the Human Rights Campaign Corporate Equality Index. So I think it can be really helpful to bring in something from outside and say, oh, I went to this workshop, or I came across this thing that talks about things that we can do to make an inclusive workplace, or it's Pride Month. And so it's gotten me thinking about what we can do in our workplace. So sometimes it's helpful to have those things to be able to sort of bring that in and say, wow, here are some things we could do. And if it's a new organization, that's even better, because if you are just in the process of developing your non-discrimination policy, then make sure that it's inclusive. You know, it's sometimes harder for organizations that have all the things in place to be like, now we've got to change everything, you know, but if you're just starting out, then you can bring those things in. Also, you know, for if it's a religious organization, then, you know, religion does not equal anti-LGBTQ. You know, like religion can also be very supportive of LGBTQ people. There are LGBTQ people of all religions. And so I wouldn't assume that that organization would not be open to including things. And so I think actually, you know, sort of let's assume that people are open to it and try that out. And if people are have some resistance, then lead with curiosity. I'm really curious about what's the resistance here, and why do you think that would be problematic? And, you know, maybe they tell you something about that, and then you can, that's where you can have some dialogue back and forth. You can be like, oh, well, tell me more about, like, oh, you had something happen in your, you know, that you've seen happen. Okay, tell me about that. And let's talk about what, you know, what the current situation is right now in this time and place in this organization, and let's see if we can find some solutions together, you know. So I think that might be a way of starting to approach it.
So I think I know that, you know, we talked a lot so far today about advocacy in these different ways, almost in like everyday activism, but also on a larger scale, like how can we create how can we affect policy and change at work? I'm curious to hear from you if you could share some of the advocacy work that you've engaged in that has felt most rewarding to you. And I also want to be inclusive of your research. I know that you have a deep history of doing research, and if that has felt like advocacy for you as well, and if you could share some of that with us.
Sure. I thank you for asking that. I had mentioned that I had done training on LGBT issues for law enforcement. And part of that came out of some community-based research that I was doing, where what we really heard from the community was that the number one concern was safety from harassment and violence. And it was like, okay, so let's do something with that. And the I was partnered with the local LGBTQ organization, and they went to the chief of police. The executive director went to the chief of police and said, this is the number one priority for our community. And the chief said, okay, then I'm going to mandate a 5-hour training for every sworn officer in our city. And which was sort of shocking. But here's the thing that led up to that. One, there was a relationship between the chief of police and the executive director. And so that's the first thing that I'm going to say. Relationships are so important. Building those relationships, it's what's going to help to have a platform for advocacy. The other thing is we had data. We had data that said this is the #1 priority in our community, and bringing that forward. So I think, you know, organizations gathering data or partnering with researchers, you know, or looking at the research that's out there can really help to support advocacy work. The other thing that we did is we went to the police and we said, okay, you're going to be getting this 5-hour training. Like, what do you want to know about? So we gathered from them, you know, what they were interested in learning about. And one of the questions was, what does the community think about us? Like, what do LGBT people think about us? Because, like, I don't feel like I'm prejudiced, but I feel like people treat me like I am. And I was like, okay, I don't know what the community thinks about you, but I'm a researcher, so I can find out. So then we gathered some data about, like, what were LGBTQ people's views on local law enforcement. And here's something key. We asked about, you know, a bunch of survey questions, but then we said, tell us about an experience with law enforcement that was positive. What made it positive? Tell us about an experience that was negative and what made it negative. And here's something that was so interesting is that pretty much everybody who took the survey told us about both, had both positive and negative experiences. And so I think that that's important because, one, we want to make sure that we're finding out what the negative experiences are, because it's so important that we address those things. And when we heard about the positive experiences, when we went in and did that training, we were able to say, here are things that you can do that are really well received. And some of you are doing those things. Like, here's what you're doing well, capitalize on that. And that's also helpful. And so that's, I think, an important thing to look at in the workplace too. When you're looking at climate, when you're trying to find out what's going on, find out, like, what's working in this organization for LGBTQ folks, you know, and finding out about that and being able to capitalize on that. It doesn't mean that everybody's doing those things all the time. So you can be like, here's something that someone's doing that seems to be working. Like, let's do more of that. So that's where my research and being a researcher and thinking about how do we gather the information that we need that's going to inform our advocacy. I think relationships, data, and asking about that whole range of what's working and what are the problems that we need to address.
Thank you. So now we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please feel free to send in the chat and we will ask Dr. Israel. And I will kick it off with a question that has already been asked in the chat. So I've been keeping track of it. It says, how can we support people that come out as bisexual at work?
I am so glad you asked that question. I'm going to briefly share my screen again because I wanted to say one more thing about bisexuality and bisexual people in the workplace. So this is a little bit of information about bisexual issues in the workplace, that bisexual people are experiencing some very negative things. I mean, not too many, but some people are being fired because they're bisexual. Some people are being denied work opportunities, not hired for a job, not promoted, given an unfair review, being sexually harassed because of their sexuality. That's up to, like, you know, over 30%. This one I find so interesting, being exposed to biphobic jokes at work. You know, over half of bisexual people are hearing negative stuff about bisexuality at work. So the first thing that we can do is not do that, you know. So the first thing we can do is not do that, whether or not someone's come out as bisexual. Don't make anti-bisexual jokes. Don't make anti-LGBT jokes. Don't say negative things about LGBT people in the workplace, because people hear that and it really affects them. The thing, even if it's a joke, people go, well, it was just a joke. It doesn't matter that it was just a joke. It can be really hurtful. So I think also if somebody comes out to you as bisexual, like, thank them for it. It says something about you that they were willing to share that with you. And you might say, you know, how is it for you being bisexual in our workplace? Is there anything that we could be doing better? So I think those kinds of questions can be really helpful. Also, do educate yourself about bisexuality. There are a lot of stereotypes about bisexual people that that are really harmful for bisexual people to hear. And so let's see, I'm going to share with you I'm going to share with you 2 links to more information about bisexuality, and one of them is particularly about bisexual people in the workplace. But the other one is just about what we call the invisible majority, because it turns out there are more bisexual people than lesbians and gay men put together. And transgender people are even more likely to be bisexual than cisgender people are, than non-transgender people are. And so keep that in mind in terms of if we're talking about LGBTQ issues in the workplace, we're largely talking about bisexuality in the workplace. And so it's important that we're addressing that and making sure that people are feeling seen and included and comfortable.
I love that. That's something I did not know. I too have learned something in this, that that's the issue that will come up more often, is the bisexuality in the workplace. And I think that's a learning curve for me as well. Thank you.
And I'll add one thing to that, which is that bisexual people are less likely to come out than lesbian and gay people are. And some of that is because bisexual people experience stigma from LGBTQ people as well as from heterosexual and cisgender people. And so it's they're really kind of in this double bind there. And so that's where creating a really proactively inclusive workplace environment for bisexual people can help more people to feel comfortable coming out.
Good to know. I appreciate that. We have another question. It's a long question, so I'm going to do my best to synthesize it because I think I understand what they're trying to ask. And so the question is that how can someone the question comes from someone who identifies as younger, they're 24 years old, but they grew up with a lot of LGBTQ plus and diversity and inclusion positivity. So they share that at work, thinking about their Zoom backgrounds and different things like that, but they work in a conservative financial environment and have been told that things may feel inappropriate for the workplace. And so they want to know, how do they get their point across about inclusion and diversity without being reduced to that they're just being naive because of their age and inexperience?
Yeah. So this is where that generational piece is really interesting, and this is where also the dialogue across political lines is really interesting, because there's a lot of intersection around that. So a lot of people who are, more progressive and feel like that's just kind of the environment that they were raised in, and the generation and the time period that they were raised in. So it feels really natural to express all of that really openly and everywhere. And it feels really restrictive to not share that. So I think this is one of the interesting conversations to have. Is I'm always curious about, like, oh, if I'm sharing this stuff and you're uncomfortable with that, like, oh, I'm really curious about what is that like for you when I'm doing that? What happens for you when I am and I'm looking a little bit at this, when I'm saying Black Lives Matter, when I'm putting up, rainbow flag in my Zoom background for Pride Month, like, what's that like for you? And so when people say inappropriate, it's like, okay, well, that's this sort of, that's a way of us distancing ourselves from our actual reaction, saying that's not appropriate in the workplace. Well, if it's causing you some discomfort, like I'd like to know more about that. So that's where, rather than sort of just thinking about these people are, they're not open to this, or they're shutting me down, maybe want to know more about it. And same thing on the other side of it. If you are feeling like, why on earth do people have to keep saying these things and putting up the flags and all of this stuff, maybe get more curious about that. Maybe ask the people who aren't LGBTQ but seem to be into it, like tell me a little bit more about, like, why do you think that this is a good thing for us to be doing? Like how is it affecting you in our workplace, you see? And that kind of conversation, I think, is so much more interesting even than a conversation about what's appropriate in the workplace, but really knowing, like, how are people responding to things?
I appreciate that. I think that goes back to what you were saying earlier about the education piece and being able to using conversations as an education tool.
I
Um,
also put a link to information about my stuff on dialogue across political lines in the chat. If anyone is looking for some resources, then you can find some things there.
and I can also vouch, I have read a part of the book, I'm not all the way through, but excellent. I appreciate the book. There's another question. As someone who identifies as bisexual, queer, and pansexual, I am not only invalidated by people in the heterosexual community, but also in the gay lesbian communities. How can I combat this?
It's so exhausting, right? It's because it feels like there's not a place to turn. So I think the first thing is hopefully find some bisexual community, find some support for yourself. There's a lot online now, which is great. The Bisexual Resource Center, I think, is a great place to look. There's also organizations in some like physical communities, but now things are more virtual. So I think finding some other people. What I've heard from the people in our bisexual discussion group in Santa Barbara, California, people say, this is where I come, where I can be whole, where I can be my full self. And it's so important to feel like there's a place that you can be whole. The thing about LGBTQ communities, it's so hard because that's where you think that you're going to find support. And when you don't, it can really be even more devastating. And so one of the things that we can do is encourage if we've got a local LGBTQ organization to say, can you do some training for your staff on bisexuality? Can you do some programming on bisexuality? And I got to tell you, that advocacy takes a long time. It's taken me a long time to see any difference in that, but there's starting to be some inroads. And so I'm seeing that in a lot of places, there's more happening with that. Also, September 23rd is Celebrate Bisexuality Day or Bisexual Visibility Day. So that's a great time for a workplace to do something. I know, in modern health, you've got circles, so that you've got kind of affinity circles with people who have different identities and stuff. Like that's a great opportunity to do an event or to start, putting the word out there like, hey, we're going to start a bisexual affinity circle. If anyone wants to join, we'll have our first meeting on Celebrate Bisexuality Day, September 23rd. So those kinds of, this is where like the pride stuff and the events and things seem like, like what awareness month are we in now? But I think about them as opportunities because maybe there hasn't been something, but it gives you a good excuse to do that. National Coming Out Day, October 11th is another good opportunity to do it. March is Bisexual Health Awareness Month. That's another good opportunity. So I think trying to create things in the workplace, but also just if you are lesbian, gay, transgender, not bisexual, and just know that your acceptance of and inclusion of bisexual people is so important. We need you to help us to feel included because we don't feel included, anywhere else either. And it's not easier being bisexual. People think it's easier being bisexual. Bisexual people actually have even more of those health disparities and mental health disparities than lesbian and gay people do. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you for who asked the question. It sounds like that's also a space where as allies and colleagues that we can be supportive is helping to bring visibility to celebrating and recognizing bisexuality when we're recognizing everyone else on the LGBTQ. And then we have one last question, and then I'll ask you for some closing remarks. The last question says, when it comes to workplace climate, how would you recommend starting a conversation with leadership around being tokenized and shouldering all of the groundwork around anything LGBTQIA plus related?
I remember sort of earlier on in my career when I first came to my university and I was asked to be on so many different committees because as a queer woman of color, there aren't that many of us in academia. And so then my department chair asked me to be on another committee and I sent a list of all the committees I was on and I said, before I, respond to whether or not I'd like to do this committee, I just have a question like, these are all the committees that I'm on. Is this a typical workload for people at, my level? And he said, never mind, I'll find somebody else, because it was clearly not. And so one of the things I always remember is sometimes people aren't aware of how much labor we're doing as marginalized people. And so sometimes we just need to, like, I wasn't being mean about it. I was just like, here's some documentation of what I'm already doing. And then he got it. So I would say that's about, like, shouldering all the responsibility. People don't always recognize how much you're doing. And so sometimes it can be helpful to document that. Say, like, okay, here are all the things that I'm doing. Can can I get some assistance with this? Can you assign somebody else to do some of these things? Because this is a lot for one person. So I think reminding people of that and kind of going in with that kind of attitude. Now, one of the challenges with that, of course, is that they might say, well, if you don't do it, there's not anyone else who's going to do it. So you're feeling like, if I'm not doing it, then it's not going to happen. So that might be where maybe, like, if the higher ups are not, like, taking that on themselves to do something about, maybe talking to people who are allies or who want to be allies and saying, look, I'm doing a lot of work here. Here's the best thing you could do as an ally, is to actually do some of these things so that I don't have to. So the actual labor of it is one of the best ways that you can be an ally, as long as it's really informed by what LGBTQ people really want you to be doing. Then actually doing the labor probably makes more of a difference than, crafting the perfect statement to say.
Thank you, Dr. Israel. The conversation today has been awesome. I've learned a lot that I personally would like to apply, not just in my workplace here at Modern Health, but in my community, and thinking about who am I not thinking about. That's what this conversation has really got me considering, is who is invisible that I am not considering when I am working to try to be inclusive. So I appreciate that. As we wrap up, I just want to ask if you have any last kind of thoughts, comments, guidance that you would like to offer to the audience who has joined us today.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you. This is wonderful that you are here today. And and Jessica, I want to say again, thank you so much to you and to Modern Health for creating this space and inviting me to do this. That says that there's a priority here, on your part, and that's the kind of thing that other workplaces can do to say, this is a priority, is to create space for programs, for training, for conversations. I think that's so important. So you all have done the first thing just by attending this. That's tremendous. And we all need to figure out ways of moving through a changing landscape, is the other thing I would say. Like I said, things have changed a lot in the last 20 years of the work that I've been doing. They're going to keep changing, and trying to keep up with things can be hard. So we all have to somehow be flexible and a little bit forgiving of ourselves and each other, and at the same time trying our best. So I think that's a sort of combination of things that I would encourage. And just want to say, y'all are doing great by being here today. Thanks so much for your questions, for your engagement. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank everyone who attended and submitted questions in the registration and the chat. We really appreciate it. And it's helped us all learn a lot. And so we appreciate everyone coming out on this Tuesday afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.